Hi, my name is Mark and welcome to The Active Listener, where we aim to listen, not just hear. We firmly believe that everyone has an interesting story to tell, if given the space to do so. So listening to what our guests have to say, you may learn something.
Hello, Mark, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm John James. I'm the Chief Executive of the Sickle Cell Society, which is a national charity of probably about 43 years standing, and I've been its Chief Executive for the last 8 years.
Thanks, John. Tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get to where you are now?
So let's roll back, Mark, to my career briefly, a very quick canter through the background. My mother was a nurse. My father was a tailor. I have an uncle who sadly died recently, who tried to get into medical school in the late 50s, wasn't able to, but luckily got into Howard University, which is a black university in Washington, and became a doctor. The relevance of all of that is, as I was growing up, health was an important factor in the household. And both my parents used to say, oh, well, look at Uncle Rupert, that was his name. Look at Uncle Rupert, you should aspire to be a doctor, John. That's what you should do. Uncle Rupert can do it. You can do it. So in all those years, there was very much driven by my parents wanted me to succeed and do the best I could. I had the opportunity to join a sort of local management training scheme and join the NHS. I was kind of shocked about the management of the NHS and how people were treated. I was treated particularly badly because in the early days and had challenges later on. So when I got into the scheme, I was supposed to be working in finance, for example. It was supposed to be a finance department. But I was later told that the reason I didn't start in finance was the finance director made it absolutely clear that there were no black people to be allowed in his department. Wow. So I was offloaded to some other department. And I was told that some years later. I didn't know that. I was on some administrative error, and I'd have to go to some other department. But I was told that by a very senior person who was involved with the scheme and involved in the allocation process and so forth. So I spent my career in the NHS, man and boy, and I have to say I've been very privileged to have had a good career in the NHS. One of the things that drove me was quality of management in supporting people, whether they were black, white, male, female, whatever, was exceedingly poor. The culture was pretty clubby and pretty incestuous. I was determined then. I said, well, look, I'm sure I could do better than this. So I was driven to want to succeed in the NHS by virtue of wanting to make a difference, wanting to help develop and grow people so that we could provide better services and be more accessible. So that's where I spent my career. And as I say, I've been privileged. I was lucky to climb up the greasy pole. I've done over 4 chief executive jobs in the NHS. It was never easy. And one of the interesting things that I look back on now, but my lens was very much about thinking how as a collective, we improve things for the people of the local area, whether I was in a hospital or commissioning services, finding that, some of my peers, they might be in a pretty inner city area, but actually were colourblind to the sorts of issues and needs of communities in those areas. And that's where Sickle comes in, because I've always known about sickle cell for various reasons. But I remember in one organisation where I was the chief executive, I prioritised. It was an area that needed NHS sickle services. Some of the neighbouring boroughs had some, but this borough didn't. And I made sure that service was commissioned. And I remember talking to my peers about it one time, and somebody said, "But John, ministers are not interested in that. They're only interested in the money, i.e., financial bottom line, and they're only interested in A&E and the performance target." So, so I think that was very telling about how you can focus on national priorities, which is right to focus on national priorities, but equally balance that with ensuring that there are policies that are relevant and appropriate for the local community as well.
It strikes me that there's a core theme here of wanting to make a difference, of encouraging people to grow. It's clear as well from what you were saying earlier that your family, your parents particularly, were eager for you to go into the medical profession. At what point did it go from something they wanted to something that was on your own agenda that you wanted to pursue yourself?
Well, I ended up in the NHS by accident. I'd applied to be part of this local training scheme, and what drove me was getting a job, earn a decent wage, and have potential to progress in that career. And if you think about it today, 2021, the NHS is a huge employer, but it has so many facets that it has opportunities for many people to craft a career, whether that's a clinical career, whether it's a science career, nursing career, whatever. There are a whole number of strings to the NHS bow. I think two other factors that were important in that was the family. So, I had a sort of cousin who was a nurse, and I think that, I grew up in a household where the challenges for black people in the 50s, both in the United Kingdom, the United States, were very clear. So, in our household, Malcolm X, who, by the way, whose mother is from the same island as my parents, the lovely Grenada. So Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, in South Africa, Nelson, there were struggles that black people across the world were seeing, and those were conversations. So the sense of, joining an organisation wasn't going to be without challenge. So it was always clear. I think that drive was about, if you get in, you have to stand your ground. And so all of that was in the kind of DNA. And as I say, I went in, there was quite direct racism, and that racism still exists today. You just look at 2021, whether it's football, whether it's the most recent Yorkshire cricket inquiry, you name it, the report that the government issued a few months ago, which was really orchestrated to suggest things were okay, weren't really, things were getting better. Well, clearly they're not getting better. So roll back, 40 years, and these things about, racism exists. Don't think you're going to go into the NHS and it will be all fine. My parents knew what it was like. I mean, I remember my mother saying that if she was sitting next to a white person on the train or the bus, she would get looks, or somebody would walk past and make a comment. Whether, we like to hear it or not, that's how it was. I guess, for my children who, are British and born here, they didn't see all of that, but they certainly know what nuanced racism is, because these days it's not, you're not called the N-word in your face or whatever. You might do, you might get it on social media or whatever, but it was prevalent in the 60s and 70s. And so it's important that you use that to drive wanting to, live in a world where people treat one another with respect. I don't expect people to always agree with me, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't treat me with respect as I would do them.
It's testament to your character, John, that you took such negative experiences and put them towards something so positive in terms of the actions you've been taking. Where do you see things going in the UK and the NHS in regards to racism?
That's a very good question, and I have to say, and this sounds less than optimistic, but the UK is going backwards at the moment in terms of race. And why would I say that? Well, I've used two sporting analogies. So the recent Yorkshire Cricket Club, where they sort of classed racism as, well, just banter. So, let's move on. It was just banter. So in the boardrooms of a lot of not just sporting institutions, but corporate ones as well, there is a distinct lack of diversity at leadership level. The country, whether people accept, has lurched to a much more right-wing style. Now, whatever one's views about Brexit, part of that was about immigration, whether we like it or not. And in this case, Eastern European and the question of free movement. And it's quite acceptable, I think, for some politicians. Farage was part of that, to, talk quite openly about, as did Margaret Thatcher, when, about being swamped and so forth. So the point is that these things, rather than a one-off or occasional, are suggesting a country that doesn't yet feel comfortable with diversity, and not just a country. I'm talking about within the country, august institutions that don't feel particularly comfortable about diversity. But what they don't reckon with is that the young children of diverse backgrounds are British, and they will have a very different perspective about how things should be, and a lot of them will know the experiences of their parents and their grandparents. And the fact that more Black history is being taught in schools, and we see a lot in the press about gangs and Black people being associated with gangs and killing one another. But in the same token, there are many Black and brown young people who are doing very well in all walks of society, whether it's law, whether it's medicine, whatever it might be. And I think that isn't being picked up or built upon. So on the one hand, whilst I'm saying to you that the country as a country, and I think that has to do with leadership, is not speaking up about these issues, because it's not the narrative that certainly the current government wants to talk about. But I think there's a grassroots build-up of young people. And I think some of that, not all of it, but some of it was driven by the killing, and that's what it was, the killing of George Floyd. So I think those things are beginning to add to a challenge that, just as there was a challenge in our parents' day and they stood up with it, it's another different type of challenge that young people and older people are wanting to make sure that we don't lapse back into those dark days again. And I think the Black history point is important, because I remember talking to a young person who said that they were surprised at how many important historical things involving Black people whitewashed over centuries, and some of that is coming to light now. So I think on the one hand, it's less than optimistic about the direction and leadership of the country on the issue of race. I think that will be and is being challenged by the younger generation, as it was in the 50s, in the 60s. There's always a challenge. It's a different type of challenge now, but that challenge is there. The NHS, well, you asked about the NHS as well. The NHS, when I was in the NHS, I was in a club called the Less Than 1% Club, because there were less than 1% of us who were from a diverse Black or brown heritage. And I think the NHS is changing, but it's incredibly, incredibly slow. So it is changing for the better, and it'd be churlish to kind of hark back to some of the days and my own experience. But it's slow, and I also think that part of the reason it's slow is that it needs more high-level leadership to speak up and enable those changes to move at a more rapid pace. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a very large global company for an event for Black History Month, and I was talking to a very switched-on director of that company, and one of the comments he made with me, he said, "Look, our clients are looking to us to be diverse. So there's a business imperative for some companies to be more diverse." If you look at all the FTSE 100 companies, you can probably count on one hand, if you're lucky, that diverse leadership. And then if you even then delve a bit deeper into that in terms of boards, non-executive directors, executive directors, the numbers will be small. And that takes me back to the point about regression. So when the government issued that really dreadful report about race and disparities, it was so trying to paint a picture that things were much better in the UK than they were in other parts of the world. Well, that's not good enough. it needs to show that there is real change and there's an appetite for change. And sadly, that's what's that sort of leadership is distinctly lacking at the moment.
So how have you seen a way that you can have an influence? What is your role in terms of tackling and facing the issues that we have had and continue to have?
Throughout my career in the NHS, in the Department of Health and Social Care, it was always driven by wanting to make a difference, and wanting to make a difference for everybody, not just a particular group or the majority population, which is linked to my point, is if you're managing a hospital in Bradford or the Midlands or London, you're going to have diverse workforce, you're going to have diverse patients, and you should really take time to make sure that diversity is understood and also, in my view, reflected in the leadership of the organisation. There's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't be the case. So for me, it's always been about making a difference. And I think that, I've been lucky to have had good mentors. And this is me giving a sort of big up to mentorship, because throughout my career, I've always sought advice from people who were good leaders and people who were able to guide me in a trusted way, because there'd be some people out there that you work with who would stab you in the back without any concerns whatsoever. So mentorship is important. I think I'll give you an example about Sickle and why. So in the last 6 months, we've been undertaking an inquiry into the care that people who live with sickle cell receive in hospital. In gathering that evidence, we've talked to people who live with a condition, we've talked to people who care for family members who live with a condition, we've talked to doctors, we've talked to nurses, we've talked to corporate organisations. And overwhelmingly, what's come out of that inquiry is that people don't get the best care, something we knew. More worryingly is that people have died as a consequence of not getting the right care. So in other words, we're dealing with a proportion of preventable deaths. When you roll back further and say, well, why are they not getting the care? Whether they are in, a hospital that's been treating people with sickle cell for decades, or a hospital with small numbers of sickle cell patients, what comes through is so this is where point this one to the NHS. This is where the NHS have neglected this condition over many decades. So what I mean by that is that the neglect is partly, this is not so important, so we're not going to invest in it in the way that we might invest for services that, let's say, the majority population or the Anglo-Saxon population might suffer from. So for what's come out from the NHS perspective is they're absolutely neglected. From an industry perspective, and by industry I'm talking about pharmaceutical companies and research and development, a complete lack of research and development in terms of finding new disease-modifying treatments or over many, many decades. That's changing. So if an industry person was listening to me now, they'll say, that was true probably 10 years ago, but not anymore. And that's true. Things are changing. But what's the evidence for that? So one licensed treatment for sickle cell, there's now two, because in the last month, NICE and NHS England, NICE being the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, and NHS England have agreed a second one. But if you compare that to the treatments that have been approved by NICE and NHS England for cystic fibrosis. Now, I make no criticism of cystic fibrosis. They're a great organisation. I know the chief executive, and it's a challenging condition. But actually, 96-97% of that population is of an Anglo-Saxon heritage, whereas in contrast, sickle is essentially a black and brown. There are people who are not non-black with sickle, but if you compare the two, for cystic fibrosis, there's well over 10 new treatments for sickle cell license. So you have to identify when that there are health disparities or health inequalities, whichever way you want to describe it. But what you have to think about, well, why is that? Why is that? And I'm saying to you, and it's controversial, some people disagree with me, whether it's industry, although industry training, whether it's the NHS, it's because it takes us back to prioritise things. We're of a lesser order, and it's to do with race. So, and that's come out not because we've engineered it to come out. This is what patients and clinicians have told us, and we hopefully will be producing that report in the next week or so. But fundamentally, all those things lead back to leadership. So whether you are the Prime Minister of a country, whether you're the Chief Executive of an NHS organisation, the Chief Executive of a large, you have to provide leadership on the topic, be seen to be making a difference, which is why making a difference is so important. You look at companies like Nike, it could be any company, but actually they make a lot of money on, inverted commas, black culture, whether, that's clothing, apparel, whatever. They speak up about Black Lives Matter, but are they doing the things in their organisation to ensure that the organisation is diverse? So it's not only, public sector organisations, and I say all roads lead back to leadership. And if the leadership isn't there that says it's right that we are a diverse organisation, it's right that we have diversity at all levels in the organisation, I think we will struggle. But as I said to you earlier, I think that whether it's black power salutes in Olympic Games compared to taking the knee at the moment, but history shows people are not going to be tolerated to be treated in a different way. And they're going to call out when organisations say things but don't do things that improve diversity.
So what are your thoughts, John, on taking the knee?
I'm going back to the Black Power salute. I think taking the knee is perfectly appropriate. And I think that, a lot of people who aren't comfortable with it are the people who either don't recognise the failings, and that's what they are. They're failings and challenges. I don't think it's acceptable that any black or Asian footballer is abused. I remember as a child watching a young West Ham chap called Clyde Best. He received the most outrageous abuse, and he wasn't the only one. So I think that taking the knee is perfectly appropriate, and it came from Colin Kaepernick in the States, and I think you have to remember why he wanted to do that. He wanted to make a gesture so that people realise, and he was vilified for it. Vilified for it by the then President of the United States. Who on the one hand vilified him, but says, look what I'm doing for black people. It's an oxymoron, to say the least.
What do you consider, John, to be key elements of being a good leader?
So that's a good question. I think good leadership is about leaving a sustainable legacy. And that is one of the things that I feel is important, and sustainable legacy, because you can leave legacies that are dismantled or eaten away over time. But a good leader leaves really sustainable legacies. He or she needs to have their ear to the ground, and walk the talk. I mean, it's you can be quite isolated from what the general gist of the day is. And a good example is the recent scandal about Owen Paterson, for example. Mm-hmm. Now, if you talk to the man on the Clapham Omnibus or the woman on the Clapham Omnibus and you say, look, let's find a way to keep Owen Paterson in not having his suspension, and let's change the rules at the same time, most people said, well, why would you do that? That would be mad. But MPs were whipped. They were whipped to vote this way. And then 24 hours later, or probably a bit more, oh gosh, we better change our mind. That is an example of not understanding, being divorced from what ordinary people think, and ordinary people including other MPs as well, I put into that category. So that is an example of really crass and poor leadership, which is why I say it's important as a leader also to have your ear to the ground, have a vision, and take counsel and balance the right decision, and be able to make a difficult decision, because I think it is probably in the current climate more difficult to stand up for diversity than it is to go with the naysayers who say, oh yeah, no, this isn't as important as everything else. So you have to be, as a leader, be able to stand up and make difficult decisions.
How would you say your leadership is having an impact?
My leadership is having an impact largely because when I joined the Sickle Cell Society, it was going, it's a great organisation, has been for many years, but it's bereft of funds when I joined it, and it was lacking a degree of leadership at all levels. So where we have made a difference is, our organisation has an operating budget that is less than £800,000. So we're not even, we're a small organisation financially, but I can tell you, it feels at times that we play in the Champions League with the, with the big charities, and that is because, over those 8 years we have improved our credibility, not only with people who live with sickle cell, but also other organisations, other institutions like NHS England, like Public Health England. We're a force to be reckoned with. People pay attention, and there have also been significant policy changes that we have enabled, such as adult transplantation and the new second treatment that's been licensed by NHS England. So I think there are a combination of characteristics there, Mark, and some of those characteristics are about delivering things, doing things, which make a difference to the way in which people who live with the condition experience services, and there's still more to do. So I mentioned the inquiry report, and there's still more to do. So one of those characteristics is about delivering things that make a difference, that are visible not only to the policy wonks, but the ordinary on the street. And I think the other issue is this point about credibility and managing upwards, whether that's managing upwards to government, to the institutions that make the policy, like NHS England, Nursing and Midwifery Council, Public Health England, etc., Department of Health and Social Care, but actually being listened to because we're credible, we know what we're saying, and actually we are highlighting and shining a light on the disparities and health inequalities that exist for this group. You can't hide from that. If you are a man, woman, child, politician, you can't hide from the fact when you say, well, why is it that this is the experience of this group of people compared to the experience of this group of people who happen to be of, different heritage? What's the answer to that? Is it by accident? Answer, no.
You mentioned mentoring. Could you unpack that a little bit more?
Well, I look back, Mark, on my career, and I think I've been very lucky to have worked out that the fight, and that's my terms, because it was like a fight, the fight to progress and succeed wasn't going to be won by the John James one-member army. And I had to reach out to trusted colleagues, friends, and others who were in organisations to have that counsel and advice about managing complex situations. And so I've been lucky to have that in my career. And one of the things I learned when you're progressing in your career, it isn't always about the job. So this might be this fantastic job and it looks really well, but it's about the organisation as well. So if you get a fantastic job, but you're actually working with people whose values and way in which they treat people is not good, then it might not be the best place for you to go. So the membership and understanding cultures of organisations that you're joining is really important, because you'll know, certainly when it comes to diversity and race, what the reputation of that organisation is. You go and talk to a porter or a cleaner, they'll give you a good sense of the organisation. But in addition to mentoring, there's also things like learning sets. So I was involved in a learning set for a number of years with some very, very influential people as part of another training program that I did. So I, commend what you're doing with CB mentoring in your own space, because it can make a difference. And I think some people find it hard because it's like, some people feel, no, I can deal with this myself. But I think mentoring adds a different lens, different counsel. And I think good mentoring makes you think, doesn't give you always the answers, doesn't say, well, you have to do it like this, but it should allow you to think through the dilemma and think it through to a logical conclusion. So good job on what you're doing with mentorship, because I think whether you're in the private, public sector or the education sector, you're doing your exams, mentorship and learning sets can make a very positive difference.
Thank you, and that's nice of you to mention that. I think just one of the things that has really struck me regarding mentoring at CB mentoring, based in Cambridge, the thing that struck me is actually it's not always just the formal things. It's the conversations that are had just over a drink, a coffee or something, where someone who's been in a similar situation, and you just sort of have a passing conversation. And it's only like, it could be years later that you realise an impact that's had on someone's life. You think back to perhaps when you were younger and you met someone and you were going through a difficult situation and they were able to input, or just a sort of side remark that they may have said. and it really can switch your focus. So I think what we share and how we interact with people is so important.
I agree with you, Mark. I think the challenge of that, though, is the last 20 months of the pandemic, because I think those water cooler moments, or having a drink with somebody to, or a coffee or whatever it might be, I think those are important, and the pandemic has changed the way in which we interact at the moment. But I agree with you. I think those things are very important, as it is. You see, one of the things about leadership, and this goes back to kind of my parents, is that as you progress up the greasy pole and you think you might be very senior and you're, in circles of the great and the good, don't ever forget where you came from. I know who I am. I know where I was born. I know the struggles that I went through, that my parents went through, and and it goes all the way through history. Don't forget where you come from, and use that to inform the future. Use that to inform the future. That's why I remember, I worked for a top teaching hospital, which I won't mention, but I remember when I started there, my conversations were not just with the directors and the people who ran the organisation. I talked to the cooks in the kitchen, I talked to the cleaners, I talked to the porters, I talked to nurses, and all of that gives you a rich intelligence about because you'll be told by your peers at a very senior level, this is, we're a great organisation, this is, how we do things. You talk to other people and it helps you validate some of what has been said, or not, as the case may be. So I think that's important as well.
So you did sort of mention about future. So what does your future hold? What's your dream for the future? What are your next steps? Do you have any plans, goals that you want to...
I mentioned the great Uncle Rupert, who sadly passed away earlier this year in Washington, and he had a great tribute from Howard University, which was great because the country's vice president is an alumni from Howard whom he knew. But one of the things that he did when he retired was that he had a home in the island where I was born, Grenada, and he spent 6 months of the year in Grenada, sort of doing some kind of teaching at the medical school there, and then spending his summers back in the United States in Washington. And so one of my dreams is to, as I slowly wind down, that I eventually spend more time in Grenada, and because one of the things I notice as I get older, I feel the cold more. Mm-hmm. I used to play football, rugby in cold weather, do cross-country runs at school in the cold weather, but as I get older, I definitely feel the cold. So one of my aspirations is simply spending more time in Grenada with the family that are still out there, and just enjoying my life.
That sounds like a good plan. So I'd ask you if there was one interesting fact that you'd like to share and most proud of. What would it be?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I'm thinking about it, and I guess, and this might sound a little trite, but it's true, so I'm being very honest with you. I'm effectively a descendant of a slave, and I'm very clear about my history. Both my parents died before I was honoured by the Queen. And yes, it's it's empire and it's colonial, but I have to say that when I was named to be given an honour, when that envelope came through, I would just thought, gosh, I wish my mum and dad were alive and my grandparents were alive, because if you had asked them, would John James ever be honoured by the Queen, they would say, are you having a laugh? What on earth are you saying? So it isn't a fact about me, but it is something that I just want to say that my forebearers would have not thought that was even possible.
Thank you. So one of the things that we do on here is asking people to kind of share their favourite 5. What is your favourite song or piece of music, and why?
I've got lots of music. I'm a bit of a music fan. I've got a music collection that is wonderful, and I'm quite a lot. I can think of some Dennis Brown tunes. I can think of Gregory Isaac tunes, Bob Marley, Big Youth. Let me see what was very formative that, I would still listen today. And I have to say, one of my favourite songs, it's not the favourite, one of my favourites is Natty Dread by Bob Marley, because it was in my formative years, although my head is now completely bald. I did have Natty Dread in my youth, and it was a kind of call to action as far as I recall, and it was an important tune. There are lots of other tunes, as I say, Dennis, Gregory, and others, but and Big Youth as well. So these are formative things that have been part of my character growing up and still with me today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, music is such a major influence on many people, and I think to try and drill it down to one song is not. But it's interesting how it's so influential, and how a song, any particular period in history, resonates.
Correct.
Correct. Leading on to the next one, give me a hero, or at least a person you admire. Who would that be?
And that's another good one. I have to say Malcolm X. And the reason why, not because there's a Grenadian connection, which my mother told me about. If you think of the conversation we've just had, Mark, some of the themes that I mentioned about the challenges of yesteryear and the challenges today are about young people and the ability to stand up and have a voice. And of course, Martin was a great man as well, Martin Luther King. But in a sense, Malcolm was saying, I'm not going to put up with it. And yes, we can do things through peaceful means, but actually, we have to fight as well. And actually, even making the connection with some of the songs that I grew up with, it was about standing your ground. I have enormous respect for what Malcolm did.
It's interesting as well, as you're saying, certainly, and by no means am I claiming to be an expert, but certainly from Dr. King's point of view, later on in sort of his years just before his assassination, his last speech, which was not actually delivered, was much more towards that side. And indeed, Malcolm X, I know sort of latties, he was toning down off some of the rhetoric he was using. So they were both kind of nearer to one another, so to speak.
Nearer to one another. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I guess you also have to remember, Mark, in those days, it was awful. And whether it was my father's generation being chased around by teddy boys and all of that, it was terrible. And if you didn't stand up for yourself, you could be dead.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So another thing, which certainly for me is very important, food. If you were to distill that down to one thing, what would that be?
Well, I grown up, and I must make this point to my grandmother and my great aunts, because you may not know this, Mark, but in the Caribbean, you may know it, in the Caribbean, that generation, I'm talking about my grandparents and their parents, used to cook with coal pots, so there's no gas.
Yeah.
And Mark, I have to tell you, those women, because they were mainly women, men cooked as well, but they were mainly women, were the most amazing cooks with limited resources. They used to cook the most beautiful dishes. So I've grown up very much with Caribbean food all my life, and today it's still important to me, and I enjoy it very much. And I particularly like fish. Fish escabeche is one of my favorite dish, as is saltfish, salted cod, done in different ways. I have to say, I've grown up as a child in Grenada. Today, it's still one of my favorites, but I think the difference is now I have a much more eclectic range of food which I enjoy. But I said to you in conversations about leadership that you must never forget where you come from as a leader and what that means to your character and what you want for the organization. I don't leave my food behind from my history.
Absolutely. Good answer. Okay, so the next one is place. What would be your favourite place?
It's a place called Monplaisy in the island of Grenada. There's lots of places that have kind of quasi-French names. And Monplaisir is the village that I come from in St. John's, Grand Roy St. John's, and it's up in the hills, and it is the most beautiful place just to chill out, just to have a lovely breeze. The sea's down the road, and I have to tell you, when you just want to chill, reflect, think, read, with probably a beer in your hand, or if you don't drink a soft drink, that's the place to be.
Sounds idyllic. Okay, and then finally, you can choose a book, film, or video game. Which would be your favourite? What would be your go-to?
Well, it would have to be a film. I watched in the last week a film called The Harder They Fall, with Idris Elba, Regina King, and some other great actors. And I have to tell you, I thoroughly enjoyed it because it's the most recent one that I've seen. Not only was the storytelling very good, but it's the first time, apart from a few others in the sort of noughties and 2000, where there was a story about black cowboys. And I thought that was really, really interesting. So that's what I would pick, because it's fresh in my mind. And I remember saying to my daughter after I'd seen it, I said, "Have you seen The Harder They Fall? I was quite impressed with it." And she said, "No, but I'm going to watch it."
Well, thank you, John. I to be honest, I could sit here listening to you all day. And I really appreciate your candor and giving up some time in your busy schedule to have a conversation. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. Until next time, remember, help people feel valued. Listen, don't just hear.